Tell me something. If the most powerful woman in the world, the Queen of England, was called the Virgin Queen, kings, princes, even her own courtiers turned her body into their favorite battlefield. They mocked her, lusted after her, and spread rumors so disturbing they could ruin an empire. And you know what? Elizabeth fought back in the most twisted way possible, by turning her sexuality into a weapon sharper than any sword. This is not the fairy tale queen you read in school. This is a story of humiliation, political cruelty, and sexual games so disturbing they still echo through history. And I promise you, by the end of this video, you'll never look at the so-called Virgin Queen the same way again. So do me a favor, grab your headphones, lock the door, and stick around till the last chapter. Because if you think kings had all the power, wait until you hear how Elizabeth played them like fools. Elizabeth I of England, crowned in 1558, built an image that would define her reign and haunt her legacy, the Virgin Queen. She stood apart from the dynastic traditions of Europe, where a woman's worth was measured in her alliances, her dowry, and her ability to bear children. For Elizabeth, her virginity became a shield, a strategy, and a prison. What seemed like strength to her people was, in reality, a lifelong struggle against the crushing weight of political expectation, misogyny, and bodily scrutiny. In the 16th century, queens were never judged by their laws, their diplomacy, or their intellect alone. Their greatest currency was reproductive. A queen's body was not her private possession. It was a vessel expected to deliver heirs, to bind kingdoms, and to prevent dynastic wars. For Elizabeth, every suitor was a negotiation not of love, but of conquest. Her chastity was questioned, measured, and dissected in courtrooms and foreign councils. The debates were rarely about Elizabeth as a person. They were about her body, her womb, her capacity to reproduce. Foreign ambassadors wrote about her menstrual cycles, her appearance, and even the firmness of her breasts. Pamphlets circulated in Europe, some mocking her refusal to wed, others accusing her of hiding deformities. Whispers suggested she was incapable of consummation, that her virginity was not a virtue but a defect. In a world where women were reduced to their fertility, Elizabeth turned the weapon against her enemies, but never escaped its cruelty. Marriage was a battlefield that stretched beyond her court. Proposals arrived from kings, princes, and dukes, each designed to strip her sovereignty. Philip Thierry of Spain, widowed after her sister Mary's death, positioned himself as a suitor. His interest was not in Elizabeth's person, but in controlling England. The Archduke Charles of Austria, the Duke of Anjou, and countless others followed, their emissaries pressing Elizabeth's counselors with demands. Each offer came with veiled threats: marry or face isolation, invasion, or rebellion. Elizabeth mastered the art of delay. She entertained proposals, dangled promises, and then withdrew. To her council, she spoke of divine calling and national unity. To Europe, she portrayed herself as cautious, virtuous, and wise. But beneath the polished rhetoric lay a harsher truth: she was cornered. To marry was to surrender her crown to a foreign power. To refuse was to face endless suspicion, slander, and accusations of perversion. The most humiliating negotiations were often personal. In 1569, when her cousin Mary, Queen of Scots, was imprisoned in England, Catholic factions argued Elizabeth's unmarried state proved her unfit to rule. Her virginity, once painted as sacred, was twisted into an accusation she was barren, incomplete, perhaps even unnatural. By the 1580s, when she was well past childbearing age, her refusal to marry became both weapon and curse. She had secured her independence, yet endured endless ridicule. At home, rumors multiplied. Elizabeth's closeness to Robert Dudley, her childhood companion, inspired whispers of secret children, hidden affairs, and unholy unions. Courtiers speculated that her virginity was a mask, a deception crafted to cover shame. Others claimed she was no woman at all, that her body concealed deformities. In pamphlets and satirical ballads, her most intimate identity was dragged into the public square, debated as if she were livestock at auction. This constant scrutiny carried real dangers. In a patriarchal world, a woman who did not submit to marriage was seen as unnatural, even monstrous. Elizabeth wielded her image as the Virgin Queen to transform her supposed weakness into power, declaring herself wed to her kingdom, her body belonging to England alone. The symbolism was brilliant, but it came at immense cost. She was forced to erase her private desires, to carry the weight of a nation's survival in her womb, and in her refusal to use it. The marriage game haunted her until death. By remaining unmarried, she denied foreign rulers control of England. She avoided the bloodshed that might have come with disputed heirs. Yet her decision left her dynasty fragile. When she died in 1603, she left no child, no heir of her blood, only the fading illusion of a body preserved for England. The Tudor line ended, and the crown passed to the Stuarts. Her virginity had been both shield and shroud. In the end, Elizabeth I became the embodiment of a paradox, celebrated for chastity, yet punished for it, exalted as sovereign, yet reduced to her body. The marriage game was not about her choices alone. It was a system designed to strip women of autonomy, to measure them as vessels, to mock them when they resisted. Elizabeth mastered the game, but she never escaped it. Her legend was born not only of glory, but of humiliation. By the 1570s, Elizabeth I had ruled England for nearly 2 decades. She had outmaneuvered her council, silenced rivals, and presented herself as sovereign above all men. Yet beyond England's shores, her reputation was dissected with cruel fascination. Nowhere was this more apparent than in France, where her name circulated in courtly whispers, not as a monarch, but as an object of intrigue. The French kings and their brothers saw Elizabeth not as untouchable, but as negotiable. Among them was Henry, Duke of Anjou, a man whose personal scandals mirrored the chaos of the Valois dynasty. He was theatrical devout and notorious for indulgences that left courtiers sneering behind closed doors. Yet for Elizabeth, he became a pawn in the endless negotiations of marriage. His name floated before her as though her body could be weighed against political favor. The French court delighted in speculation. Was Elizabeth truly chaste, or did her carefully crafted image mask a private life less restrained? Ambassadors were dispatched to observe her closely, recording not only her speeches, but the flicker of her eyes, the warmth of her hand when touched, the curve of her lips in laughter. Every glance and smile was noted, then sent back to Paris to be dissected in council. These reports read less like diplomacy than voyeurism, as though the Queen of England's virtue were a performance to be judged. Henry, Duke of Anjou, proved a particularly humiliating episode. In 1570, when his hand was offered in marriage, Elizabeth played her usual game of delay. She allowed the negotiations to continue, dangling the promise of alliance with France. But Henry, only 20 years old at the time, found himself mocked even within his own court. The idea of an aging English queen, well past her youthful bloom, became a point of ridicule. Courtiers whispered that Elizabeth hungered for a boy too young for her, that her chastity was nothing more than a mask for lust. When the match collapsed, the French spread rumors of Elizabeth's supposed desperation. They painted her not as a strong monarch, but as a woman starved of intimacy, too proud to admit her failings. This narrative was carried by diplomats and pamphlets alike, staining her image across Europe. The cruelty lay not only in the rejection, but in the suggestion that her body was a subject for public judgment. The humiliation did not end there. Soon after, Henry's younger brother, Francois, Duke of Anjou, was paraded before Elizabeth. Known for his recklessness and rumored indulgences, Francois represented everything Elizabeth sought to resist, yet the negotiations dragged on for years. To her council, this was political theater. To Europe, it became a grotesque spectacle. Satirists joked of an English queen who flirted shamelessly with French boys, keeping her crown by dangling her sexuality. The ambassadors' reports from this period reveal how deeply Elizabeth's identity was reduced to her body. They spoke of her clothing, her cosmetics, her laughter, and her supposed enjoyment of flirtation. Rarely did they mention her statecraft, her strategies, or her survival in a hostile world. To France, Elizabeth was less a sovereign ruler than a mystery to be solved. A woman whose virtue could not possibly be real, whose virginity must be deception. What emerges is a picture of profound violation. Elizabeth had chosen virginity as a weapon, a shield against the loss of power that marriage would bring. But her enemies twisted that weapon into mockery. The French painted her not as chaste, but as deceitful. Her refusal to marry was framed as weakness, her flirtations as proof of hypocrisy. A woman who ruled with iron was reduced to a body scrutinized for imagined secrets. Even her aging became part of the humiliation. By the 1580s, Elizabeth was well beyond childbearing years. Yet still the French pressed negotiations, not out of genuine hope for heirs, but as a way to keep her dignity exposed. Each failed proposal deepened the ridicule, transforming her into an object of pity and scorn. The Virgin Queen, once feared for her independence, was mocked as a lonely woman clinging to power through coy games of seduction. In truth, Elizabeth had never surrendered her body to the French court. She wielded her virginity with ruthless intelligence, bending it to serve England's independence. Yet in doing so, she endured a constant stripping of humanity. Her sexuality was debated in royal councils, mocked in taverns, and gossiped about in pamphlets. She was denied the privacy of personhood, her every gesture catalogued as evidence for or against her chastity. For Elizabeth, survival meant accepting humiliation. She played the game because to refuse entirely was to risk isolation. But the cost was steep. She became a living contradiction, praised as sovereign yet ridiculed as a woman. The French court's obsession left scars not on her body, but on her legacy. She would forever be remembered not as herself, but as the queen whose virginity was never believed. When Queen Mary Tudor died in 1558, Elizabeth inherited not only a crown, but also the burdens of her sister's past. Mary had been wed to Philip II of Spain, a marriage forged to bind England to Catholic Europe. It had been unpopular from the start, resented by English nobles who feared the nation would be swallowed into Spanish dominance. Philip himself had little affection for Mary, treating her with formality rather than tenderness. Yet upon her death, his gaze shifted to Elizabeth, her younger sister, and England's new queen. In the hierarchy of dynastic politics, such proposals were not unusual. Widowhood often turned men toward the next available woman of power, even if she was kin to the deceased. But in Elizabeth's case, the suggestion carried grotesque implications. Philip had been her brother, in law, her sister's husband. To marry him would not merely join England to Spain. It would create the image of Elizabeth as a replacement body, a vessel swapped in to continue the same political project. The Spanish court framed it as logical, even respectable. A king widowed by one sister might naturally look to another, they reasoned, to secure alliances and produce heirs. But in England and across Europe, the whispers told a crueler story. To many, it was a sordid suggestion, the Virgin Queen bedding the man who had already shared her sister's chamber. The rumor dehumanized her, reducing her body to little more than an extension of Mary's, as though the Tudor line could be treated like a chain of interchangeable wives. Elizabeth understood the stakes. Accepting Philip's hand would have bound her to Catholic Spain, extinguishing the fragile independence she sought to preserve. It would also have tethered her to Mary's memory, reinforcing the perception that Elizabeth was not sovereign in her own right, but merely a continuation of her sister's role. Refusing him, however, risked diplomatic rupture and the wrath of one of Europe's most powerful monarchs. The negotiations began, but they never carried the sincerity of romance. Philip was older, hardened by rule, and Elizabeth had already proven her determination to resist subjugation. Still, ambassadors from Madrid circled her court like vultures, pressing the proposal and spreading their own rumors to strengthen it. Reports emphasized Elizabeth's supposed admiration for Philip, her willingness to flirt with his envoys, her dependence on Spain for legitimacy. Each note sent back to Madrid distorted her actions into proof of desire. Meanwhile, pamphlets and tavern songs took the story into darker realms. Whispers claimed Elizabeth's chastity was a fraud, that she was already Philip's in secret, that the Virgin Queen was merely a mask for a woman who had inherited her sister's bed. The humiliation was sharpest not in the falsehood itself, but in the cruel suggestion that her body was transferable, that her value lay not in her mind, her crown, or her policies, but in whether she could continue the sexual bond her sister had begun. For Elizabeth, the insult was profound. Her image as the Virgin Queen was carefully cultivated, designed to protect her sovereignty from the very fate marriage would impose. To be tied to Philip in rumor, to be spoken of as a recycled wife, was to see that image undermined. The Spanish proposal was less a marriage offer than a public stripping of dignity. The cruelty extended beyond Elizabeth personally. It reflected the broader truth of how royal women were trapped in cycles of sexual politics. Sisters, daughters, widows, all were seen as movable pieces, bodies to be exchanged across dynasties for alliances and peace. Their individuality vanished beneath dynastic strategy. Elizabeth, for all her power, was still forced into that same mold. Her body was debated in foreign courts not as her own possession, but as an asset, transferable and replaceable. The refusal of Philip's hand was inevitable, but it carried consequences. Spain regarded Elizabeth's rejection as both insult and defiance. Over time, their relationship hardened into hostility, culminating in the 1588 Armada, when Philip attempted to conquer the very queen he had once courted. What began as a grotesque proposal became a war for survival, one in which Elizabeth's body, her refusal to yield it, stood as a symbol of resistance. But the rumors never truly faded. Even as Elizabeth aged and marriage proposals dwindled, the tale of her supposed willingness to lie with her sister's widower lingered. Her virginity, exalted in English propaganda, was forever questioned abroad. To some she was the untouchable virgin queen, a woman married to her nation. To others, she was a hypocrite, a deceiver, whose chastity was merely another mask. History remembers her triumph over Spain as proof of her strength. Yet behind the glory lies the memory of how that struggle began, not with ships and soldiers, but with whispers about her body. The humiliation inflicted by the Spanish proposal was not forgotten, because it revealed the cruelest truth of all, that even a queen who ruled alone, who mastered politics and defied Europe's kings, could never escape the reduction of her humanity to her sexual worth. By the late 1570s, Elizabeth I faced the relentless march of time. She was entering her mid-40s, far beyond the age when most royal women were considered useful in dynastic politics. Yet the game of marriage continued, and with it, the humiliations that had defined her reign. This time the suitor was Francois, Duke of Alençon, the youngest son of the French king. He was 2 decades her junior, brash, eager, and politically expendable. What began as negotiation quickly devolved into scandal, exposing the merciless way Europe treated women who aged in public view. Francois was no stranger to ridicule himself. His reputation in France was marked by excess, rumor, and physical imperfection. Small in stature, scarred by disease, and dismissed by many as unsuitable for high office. For Elizabeth, however, he represented a possible alliance with France, a counterbalance to Spanish aggression. She entertained his proposal not out of desire, but necessity. Yet in the eyes of courtiers, ambassadors, and pamphleteers, this match was never political. It was sexual theater. When Francois arrived in England in 1579, the scandal began immediately. Observers noted Elizabeth's visible affection toward him. She allowed familiarity, nicknaming him her frog, indulging in gestures that ambassadors described with voyeuristic precision. In a court obsessed with her chastity, even a glance or a laugh became fodder for gossip. Reports circulated that Elizabeth and the young Duke shared private embraces, that her aging body betrayed desperate longing for youth. None of this was proven, but the mere suggestion was enough to tarnish her image. The cruelty of the rumors lay in their detail. Foreign commentators mocked her wrinkles, her thinning hair, her decaying fertility. They painted her as a woman unwilling to accept age, clinging pathetically to a boy who found amusement in her affection. To her enemies, Elizabeth was transformed from virgin queen into object of lust, her power undermined by insinuations that she was ruled by desire. The very body she had used to symbolize purity was weaponized against her, cast now as grotesque. In the broader political sphere, this ridicule had devastating implications. Spain seized upon the rumors, portraying Elizabeth as a woman of unstable appetites, incapable of ruling with virtue. Catholic pamphlets described her as shameless, suggesting she had lost her virginity long ago and used marriage games to conceal her corruption. Even within England, factions opposed to the French alliance whispered that their queen had surrendered dignity for lust. Parliament itself voiced discomfort, petitioning her not to marry the Duke, warning that such a union would dishonor the crown. Elizabeth, ever the strategist, played the same balancing act she had with other suitors. She allowed the negotiations to drag on for years, keeping France interested while refusing to commit. But this time the damage was different. With younger men, her virginity had been mocked as fraud. With France her age made her a figure of ridicule, painted as desperate for intimacy she could no longer command. She could not escape the paradox: too chaste to be believed, too old to be respected, too independent to be forgiven. The insults grew sharper with time. One Spanish observer sneered that Elizabeth's chambers stank of cosmetics meant to disguise decay. Others described her as a witch, enchanting younger men into submission. Still others branded her the War of Europe, a phrase that condensed years of rumor into one brutal epithet. In this narrative, Elizabeth was not a ruler but a parody, a woman who, in refusing to be defined by marriage, was redefined by slander. Yet, despite the humiliation, Elizabeth never lost control of the game. The negotiations with France ultimately collapsed, as she likely intended from the start. But the episode left scars. Her people grew restless with the endless spectacle of courtship, while her enemies delighted in portraying her as morally bankrupt. The alliance with France failed, but the image of Elizabeth as a woman past her prime, humiliated by desire, endured. In truth, there is no evidence that Elizabeth ever surrendered her chastity to François or to any man. But history rarely records women's realities without distortion. What mattered was not the truth but the rumor, repeated until it became memory. The Virgin Queen's body was no longer simply debated. It was ridiculed, aged, and violated in words she could never silence. This was the ultimate cruelty of her reigns. Her strength in remaining unmarried gave her sovereignty, but it also condemned her to lifelong scrutiny. Every refusal was twisted into deceit, every gesture into lust, every wrinkle into shame. By the time the French negotiations ended, Elizabeth stood triumphant as queen, yet diminished in the eyes of a world that refused to see her humanity. From the moment Elizabeth ascended the throne in 1558, Robert Dudley stood beside her. Handsome, charismatic, and bound to her by childhood memories, he became her constant companion. Where she went, he followed. He attended her hunts, her dances, her councils. Courtiers noted their intimacy. The glances exchanged, the private meetings held late into the night. To the public, Elizabeth styled herself the Virgin Queen. But in the shadows, Dudley's presence invited suspicion that her chastity was nothing more than theater. Whispers spread quickly across Europe. Ambassadors wrote home with scandalous reports Elizabeth and Dudley were lovers. They claimed, trapped in a relationship she dared not acknowledge. Some described Dudley as her consort in all but name, a man elevated not by merit but by proximity to the Queen's bed. Foreign observers recorded every detail of their interactions, from a touch of the hand to the length of a gaze. The scrutiny was relentless, stripping their humanity away and recasting their bond as proof of sin. The rumors deepened when tragedy struck. Amy Robsart, Dudley's wife, was found dead in 1560, her neck broken at the bottom of a staircase. The official inquest ruled it an accident, but few believed it. To Elizabeth's enemies, the timing was too convenient. With Amy gone, Dudley was free, and Elizabeth's supposed path to marriage seemed clear. Whispers of murder spread like wildfire. Some accused Dudley of orchestrating his wife's death. Others went further, suggesting Elizabeth herself had colluded. In taverns and courts alike, the Virgin Queen was painted not as a pure sovereign, but as an adulteress complicit in bloodshed. The scandal poisoned any chance of marriage between them. Elizabeth could not risk binding herself to a man whose reputation was tainted with suspicion. Yet she also refused to cast him aside. Dudley remained in her favor, showered with titles, lands, and wealth. She elevated him to the peerage, naming him Earl of Leicester. He commanded armies in her name, though often with disastrous results. His failures on the battlefield only reinforced the idea that his power came not from ability, but from intimacy. The cruelest rumors were reserved for Elizabeth herself. Pamphlets and satirical songs accused her of carrying Dudley's children in secret, only to dispose of them before birth. Some claim she had given birth to a stillborn child, smuggled out of the palace in silence. Others accused her of disguising pregnancies beneath her elaborate gowns, feeding the notion that her virginity was a lie. These were not idle tales, they were weapons. To her enemies, exposing Elizabeth as impure was a way to delegitimize her reign. To her subjects, such stories made their queen both monstrous and pitiable, a woman enslaved by forbidden passion. In Europe, Dudley was described less as a man of influence than as Elizabeth's prisoner. Satirists depicted him as emasculated, trapped in a gilded cage where his fortunes rose and fell with her favor. The relationship was recast not as love, but as domination, a queen using her body and her power to control a man who could never be free. In this narrative, Elizabeth became cruel, keeping Dudley close but denying him the recognition of marriage, binding him in humiliation. The suspicion surrounding Amy Robsart's death never faded. Every political opponent of Elizabeth revived it when convenient, pointing to the broken body at the foot of the stairs as evidence of corruption. For Elizabeth, the incident revealed the impossible double bind she lived within. To marry Dudley would be to confirm the rumors of lust and murder. To dismiss him would be to admit that her closest confidant was unworthy of trust. She chose instead to keep him always near, but never wed, prolonging the scandal for decades. The relationship haunted her image abroad. In Catholic Europe, Elizabeth was painted as a hypocrite who cloaked sin in the language of virtue. Satirists described her as a Jezebel, a queen whose private chambers stank of corruption. In England, her people loved the spectacle yet feared the implications. If the Virgin Queen was truly bound to Dudley, then her entire political identity was a fabrication. Even Dudley's later years offered no escape. In 1588, as the Spanish Armada approached, he was at Elizabeth's side, commanding forces in her defense. Yet victory could not cleanse the stain of rumor. To the end of his life, he was remembered less for his deeds than for his role in Elizabeth's shadow. Lover, prisoner, perhaps accomplice in crimes that could never be proven. For Elizabeth, the cost was deeper still. By keeping Dudley close, she ensured that her virginity, the central myth of her reign, would forever be doubted. Every smile, every favor, every title bestowed upon him fed the cruel narrative that she had lied to her people. Her chastity was never truly hers to control. It was debated, mocked, and desecrated in stories that outlived them both. Elizabeth's reign was built on an image the untouched, inviolate Virgin Queen. Yet from the moment she claimed the crown, her body ceased to belong to herself. It became an object of statecraft, examined, questioned, and violated not with hands but with words. In a world where a queen's worth was tied to her womb, Elizabeth's virginity was never a private matter. It was a public trial. Foreign ambassadors made it their duty to report on her most intimate details. Their letters, written in the cold language of diplomacy, contained humiliating observations, the regularity of her menstrual cycles, the condition of her skin, the vigor in her step, the fading of her youth. Nothing was sacred. Every symptom of age or illness was twisted into proof of decline. To them, Elizabeth's body was not flesh but evidence, a text to be read and interpreted, weaponized against her authority. The scrutiny was relentless. When she danced, eyes tracked the firmness of her movements. When she smiled, whispers measured the depth of her wrinkles, the color of her cheeks, the brightness of her eyes, even the sound of her laughter were dissected for meaning. Was she still capable of bearing children? Was she still pure? Was she hiding some physical corruption beneath her gowns and jewels? These were not idle curiosities. They were questions that shaped alliances, wars, and marriages. Kings and rulers across Europe speculated cruelly about her virginity. Some mocked her as barren, a woman cursed to remain childless. Others suggested she was not a virgin at all but a liar whose purity was a convenient fiction. In Catholic courts, the idea of Elizabeth as the Virgin Queen was ridiculed as blasphemy, a parody of the Virgin Mary herself. To them, Elizabeth's body was the ultimate heresy, a corrupt vessel masquerading as holy. The rumors grew more invasive with every passing year. At court, her ladies in waiting were pressured to reveal secrets. Did the queen bleed each month? Did she bear scars, deformities, or signs of disease? Was her chastity truly intact? Even within her own household, she could never be certain that her most private realities would not be leaked, exaggerated, or twisted into political weapons. Her body was no longer hers. It belonged to those who sought to control or discredit her. As Elizabeth aged, the scrutiny only grew harsher. Her once celebrated beauty became a subject of ridicule. Satirists described her thinning hair, her rotting teeth, the stench of her breath. Courtiers noted the layers of makeup and wigs that concealed the marks of time. To preserve her image, Elizabeth painted her face with white lead, a poison that slowly destroyed her skin. The more she tried to mask her decay, the more her appearance was mocked as grotesque. Her body was a battlefield, and every wrinkle was treated as defeat. The cruelty was not only personal, it was political. For foreign powers, Elizabeth's supposed virginity, or lack thereof, determined England's place in the world. If she remained pure, she was a symbol of stability, a queen untouchable by the influence of men. If she was corrupted, then her throne was vulnerable, her legitimacy fragile. Every rumor, every cruel speculation chipped away at her sovereignty. Her reign was not defended by armies alone, but by the fragile myth of her body's integrity. Even her closest allies used her image for their own ends. Poets compared her to goddesses, not out of reverence but necessity. They crafted verses that praised her beauty and chastity, knowing that to suggest otherwise was treasonous. Yet these praises carried their own cruelty. They reminded her constantly that her worth, her authority, and her very identity as queen were tethered not to her mind or achievements, but to her body's imagined state of purity. As she moved into her later years, the whispers turned savage. Her childlessness was no longer just a question. It was a condemnation. She had failed, critics said, in the most basic duty of a woman, to produce an heir. The virgin queen who once turned her singleness into strength was recast as a bitter, decaying figure, clinging to youth she no longer possessed. Her virginity, once her greatest weapon, became her greatest vulnerability. Elizabeth's reign was extraordinary, yet it was always shadowed by this relentless assault. She was a monarch, but she was treated as spectacle. Her body was not allowed to age quietly, not allowed to exist in privacy. It was dissected by strangers, mocked by enemies, and doubted by her own subjects. To the world, Elizabeth Tudor was not simply a queen. She was a body on display, her flesh transformed into a canvas for the cruelties of politics and time. Elizabeth's own virginity was a subject of endless speculation, yet she ensured that the women who served her had no such ambiguity. For her, the chastity of her ladies in waiting was not a matter of personal morality, but of political necessity. Their bodies reflected upon her own, and any deviation from purity became an insult to the Virgin Queen's image. To serve Elizabeth was to live under constant surveillance, where love, marriage, and desire could lead to ruin. The rules were clear. No woman in Elizabeth's household could marry or become engaged without the Queen's explicit permission. To do so was an act of betrayal, suggesting that her ladies valued another loyalty above their devotion to her. But the harshest punishments were reserved for those who dared to bear children outside her sanction. A pregnancy without approval was treated not as a private mistake, but as treason against Elizabeth herself. Some of the most brutal cases reveal the extent of this control. Elizabeth punished transgressions with banishment, disgrace, and even imprisonment in the Tower. For these women, the shame was not confined to court gossip. It was enforced with real, physical suffering. Their honor was destroyed, their families humiliated, their futures erased. The Virgin Queen may have been mocked by foreign powers, but within her walls, she demanded absolute purity, and she enforced it with cruelty. One notorious example came in 1578, when Elizabeth's cousin, Lady Mary Howard, married without her permission. Though the union was politically insignificant, the Queen's reaction was not. Mary was banished from court, her reputation shattered, and her loyalty forever questioned. To Elizabeth, the issue was not love but authority. By choosing her own path, Mary had challenged the Queen's right to control the bodies of those closest to her. Even more shocking were the cases of secret pregnancies. Elizabeth's wrath fell hardest on Catherine Grey, sister of Lady Jane Grey. Catherine, who had married in secret and borne 2 children, was placed under house arrest and eventually imprisoned. For years she was confined, her health deteriorating, until her early death at just 27. Her only crime was to love without the Queen's blessing. In punishing her so harshly, Elizabeth revealed the depth of her own insecurity. A rival womb was not simply a threat to decorum, it was a threat to her throne. Other ladies suffered similar fates. Lady Mary Shelton was dismissed in disgrace after her affair was discovered. Anne Vavasor, a maid of honor, bore a child with the Earl of Oxford in 1581. For this, she was sent to the Tower, while Oxford himself faced only temporary confinement. The double standard was clear: men might recover from scandal, but women carried its weight for life. Under Elizabeth's rule, female sexuality was not just policed, it was punished as crime. The Queen's harshness was rooted in fear as much as in power. A court pregnancy could ignite dangerous rumors. That Elizabeth's own virginity was false, that her court was corrupt, that rival heirs might emerge from within her own circle. To prevent this, she struck swiftly and mercilessly. Each punishment was a warning, not only to the women around her, but to the world watching. The Virgin Queen would not tolerate challenges to the purity of her household, even if it meant destroying those closest to her. The cruelty carried a bitter irony. Elizabeth, mocked endlessly for her supposed chastity, responded not with compassion for women facing similar pressures, but with savage punishment. She turned the very weapon used against her outward, enforcing a standard she herself could never meet. By controlling the bodies of her ladies, she tried to reclaim control of her own narrative. But in doing so, she revealed how deeply the politics of chastity corrupted her reign. For the women around her, the result was devastating. Love became dangerous. Pregnancy was a sentence of disgrace. Marriage without permission was an act of rebellion. Their lives were consumed by fear, their choices erased by the Queen's authority. While Elizabeth crafted an image of untouchable virginity, the women who served her lived under the shadow of punishment, their humanity sacrificed to maintain her myth. The rivalry between Elizabeth Tudor and Mary Stuart was more than political. It was a contest of bodies, reputations, and the cruel weaponization of female sexuality. In the 16th century, a woman's authority was never measured only by her crown. It was measured by her chastity, her womb, and her perceived virtue. Elizabeth staked her reign on virginity, but Mary, Queen of Scots, was cast as her dark mirror, a queen whose downfall was written in accusations of lust. Mary's path to infamy began with her marriages. Widowed young after the death of the French King Francis II, she returned to Scotland already shadowed by gossip. Her second marriage to Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley, appeared politically sound but soon decayed into scandal. Darnley was violent, arrogant, and unstable. When he was murdered in 1567, suspicion immediately turned toward Mary. Within months she married James Hepburn, Earl of Bothwell, the very man many believed orchestrated Darnley's death. To Elizabeth and her allies, this union was damning. It was not merely political miscalculation, but moral collapse. A queen had married her husband's murderer, they claimed, and worse, she had done so in lustful haste. Whether Mary acted out of passion, coercion, or desperation no longer mattered. The narrative was fixed. She was adulterous, treacherous, and unfit to rule. The Scottish lords rebelled, deposing her in favor of her infant son. Mary fled south, seeking Elizabeth's protection. But Elizabeth was not inclined to mercy. Mary's very presence threatened her. As the great-granddaughter of Henry VI, Mary carried a claim to the English throne, one backed by Catholic Europe. For Elizabeth, whose legitimacy was doubted by many, Mary's body itself was a danger, a fertile rival womb that could birth an heir with stronger blood. To weaken her cousin, Elizabeth allowed the circulation of rumors that sexualized Mary's downfall. Ambassadors described her not as a monarch but as a seductress. Pamphlets accused her of debauchery. In Protestant England, Mary's Catholic faith was entwined with these charges, portraying her as corrupt in spirit and flesh alike. Elizabeth's own virginity gained power only because Mary's chastity was destroyed. The Virgin Queen could only shine against the shadow of the fallen queen. For 19 years, Mary was held captive in England. During that time, her reputation rotted in European courts. Every intrigue, every whisper of conspiracy against Elizabeth was framed not just as political rebellion, but as proof of Mary's untrustworthiness as a woman. She was painted as a schemer who used beauty and charm to manipulate men, a Jezebel who betrayed husbands, murdered rivals, and lay with lovers in reckless indulgence. The political battle between queens had become a sexual theater in which Elizabeth always played the saint and Mary the sinner. When evidence of Mary's involvement in the Babington plot reached Elizabeth in 1586, the verdict was clear. Mary was condemned for treason, but the execution that followed was staged with a cruel moral undertone. She was not simply a traitor to be punished. She was a woman to be exposed. At Fotheringhay Castle in February 1587, Mary mounted the scaffold in crimson, the color of martyrdom, but to her enemies it symbolized sin and blood. Witnesses reported how she removed her black outer gown to reveal the red beneath, a spectacle that seemed almost theatrical, though it may have been a deliberate statement of faith. Yet, for Elizabeth's propagandists, the imagery served another purpose. Mary's body was stripped and displayed as fallen, her dignity eroded by the ritual of death. The execution itself was botched and gruesome. The first blow of the axe failed to sever her head, and the second still did not finish the task. Only on the third strike was she fully decapitated. When her head was lifted, her wig came away, revealing thin gray hair beneath. A humiliation seized upon by observers. Her body, once described as dangerously beautiful, was reduced in death to frailty and decay. Even in her final moment, her femininity was exploited, her body treated as a stage upon which chastity and corruption were contrasted. Elizabeth herself did not witness the death, but she gained from it. Mary's execution was presented not merely as a defense of England, but as a victory of virtue over vice. Elizabeth, untouched and inviolate, stood as the Virgin Queen. Mary, adulterous and fallen, was erased as a queen and remembered as a scandal. The sexual politics that destroyed her reputation outlived her, cementing her as the cautionary example against which Elizabeth's myth was built. Yet the cruelty of this framing cannot be ignored. Mary was not judged as a ruler but as a woman. Her marriages, her widowhood, her coerced union, and her political missteps were all recast as sins of the flesh. The cycle that had plagued Elizabeth, of bodies scrutinized and reputations destroyed, became a weapon Elizabeth herself allowed to be used against her cousin. Elizabeth's image was carefully cultivated at home, a virgin queen, radiant, inviolate, the embodiment of national virtue. Yet beyond England's borders, that same image was subjected to a campaign of ridicule and perversion. Across Catholic Europe, hostile courts and satirists produced a cruel counter-narrative, one that reduced Elizabeth not to a monarch, but to a sexual object of mockery. For Spain and its allies, the ridicule was political. Elizabeth had defied Catholic authority, rejected marriage to powerful suitors, and steered England firmly toward Protestantism. To undermine her, her enemies attacked not her policies but her body. Rumors spread that she was barren, her womb a useless vessel. Others declared that she was frigid, incapable of desire, a woman who had denied nature itself. Still others swung to the opposite extreme, accusing her of secret promiscuity, of hiding lovers and illegitimate children behind the palace walls. The contradiction did not matter. What mattered was humiliation. Pamphlets circulated in France, Spain, and the Low Countries depicted Elizabeth in grotesque caricature. Some mocked her aging face, exaggerating her wrinkles, sagging flesh, and thinning hair. Others drew her as a harlot cloaked in regal robes, a queen whose crown barely disguised her supposed corruption. The Virgin Queen became, in these cruel fantasies, a grotesque hybrid, a dried-out virgin on one page, a lustful whore on the next. The extremes were designed not to reveal truth, but to destroy dignity. These portrayals were not idle jokes. They were instruments of propaganda, meant to weaken Elizabeth's authority and undermine England's credibility on the international stage. By sexualizing her, by stripping her of respect, her enemies sought to make her appear unfit to rule. In a world where monarchy was still steeped in divine symbolism, to tarnish her body was to tarnish her legitimacy. The cruelty cut deeper because it struck at the very heart of Elizabeth's strategy. She had chosen to rule unmarried, childless, and untouched by any man's authority. This decision had been her shield, her claim to sovereignty. But in the hands of her enemies, it became a weapon turned against her. To remain virgin was to be mocked as barren and unnatural. To show affection, even in rumor, was to be branded a harlot. Every path was twisted into shame. Kings themselves joined in this humiliation. Philip II of Spain, once her brother-in-law and would-be suitor, encouraged whispers of Elizabeth's supposed corruption. In French courts, tales of her flirtations were exaggerated into scandalous legends. Even the Pope's supporters used her sexuality as a tool of spiritual warfare, casting her not as a queen, but as a living symbol of heresy and vice. To them, she was Jezebel reborn, a woman whose throne was a blasphemy against God. The insults reached England in fragments, carried by ambassadors and travelers. Some of the pamphlets were smuggled in, their grotesque images shocking to those who saw them. Elizabeth herself may never have viewed the most obscene depictions, but she could not escape their echo. Every rumor of barrenness, every caricature of her body, chipped at the myth she had built. For a queen whose reign depended on image, these fantasies were daggers aimed at the core of her power. The personal weight of such attacks cannot be underestimated. Elizabeth had already lived her entire life under the scrutiny of men who measured her body like property. To know that across Europe, kings and satirists laughed at her as barren or corrupt was to live in perpetual humiliation. Her identity as a woman and her authority as a ruler were fused, and both were being shredded in the same cruel act. Even after victories like the defeat of the Spanish Armada, the fantasies persisted. They could not erase her military triumphs, but they poisoned her image abroad. She might win battles, but pamphleteers ensured that in the minds of Europe she remained grotesque. Her aging body, her empty womb, her unmarried bed, these became the battlefield where her enemies claimed their victories. Elizabeth Tudor's chastity was more than personal identity. It was political strategy, a theater of cruelty in which she used her body as bait. Suitors across Europe believed, or were led to believe, that they might one day possess the Queen of England. They were encouraged with tokens, flirtations, and diplomatic gestures, each suggesting that marriage was possible. But Elizabeth never intended to surrender her sovereignty to a husband. Instead, she turned the game into a weapon, a cruel spectacle in which kings and princes became supplicants, humiliated when their hopes collapsed. From the earliest days of her reign, Elizabeth recognized the advantage of ambiguity. She could not match Spain in armies, nor France in wealth, but she could make her hand in marriage a bargaining chip greater than any treasure. By remaining unmarried, she preserved her independence while holding out the tantalizing possibility of alliance. She played the part of the Virgin Queen not by hiding from desire, but by offering herself as the prize in a contest that never ended. Philip II of Spain, widowed after Mary Tudor's death, pursued Elizabeth with determination. A union would have united England and Spain under Catholic power. For a brief moment, Europe imagined the two crowns entwined. But Elizabeth never allowed it. She entertained the idea, smiled at the prospect, but withdrew before any promise was sealed. To Philip, the rejection was more than personal. It was humiliation on the stage of Europe. He was left not as Elizabeth's partner, but as her spurned suitor, mocked for believing he might rule beside her. The same cruelty was repeated with others. The Archduke Charles of Austria, brother to the Holy Roman Emperor, was courted for years. Elizabeth allowed negotiations to drag endlessly, sending envoys exchanging gifts hinting at union. Each delay drew Charles further into expectation. Yet nothing came of it. At the last moment, Elizabeth stepped back, declaring that her people did not wish her to wed. The excuse was hollow. The real truth was that she had gained the advantage, securing peace, keeping Austria hopeful, while never surrendering her body or throne. Her most infamous entanglement was with Franz, Duke of Alençon, younger brother of the French king. Despite being decades her junior, Elizabeth allowed the courtship to flourish. She called him her frog, showered him with attention, and let Europe speculate on the scandal of such a union. To Alençon, the hope of marriage was real, the prize worth every humiliation. Yet in the end, Elizabeth withdrew once more, The young duke was left not as a suitor but as a pawn, his pride shattered, his reputation scarred. This pattern repeated across decades. Dukes, princes, and kings entered the theater of Elizabeth's court believing they might win her hand. Each was led along with calculated gestures, a touch, a smile, a public dance, a private word. Each was humiliated in turn when the queen withdrew. Elizabeth's chastity, mocked abroad, became in her hands a cruel stage on which men were made vulnerable, their ambitions exposed and broken. But this cruelty was not without cost. Spurned suitors became bitter enemies. Philippa turned from would-be husband to relentless foe, launching the Armada in 1588 to invade the kingdom of the woman who had humiliated him. France too grew wary of Elizabeth's games, frustrated by her endless refusal to commit. The theater that preserved her independence also deepened the isolation of her reign. Allies who might have been gained through marriage were instead alienated, their anger festering into enmity. At home, however, the spectacle strengthened her authority. By refusing all men, Elizabeth became the sole focus of loyalty in England. Courtiers who might have served a king instead bent their lives toward the queen alone. Her body was the stage upon which loyalty and ambition were tested. To love Elizabeth was to serve England. To desire her was to be reminded that she belonged to no one. Her cruelty was also her power, yet the emotional weight of this strategy cannot be ignored. For every alliance broken, for every prince humiliated, Elizabeth herself was forced to endure endless whispers. She was accused of coldness, of deceit, of cruelty. Her virginity, which shielded her sovereignty, was turned against her as evidence of unnaturalness. Abroad, she was mocked as barren and frigid, while at home, she was worshipped as untouchable. The theater of cruelty sustained her throne, but it left her humanity in question. Elizabeth's death in March 1603 was the end of an age. For more than 4 decades she had ruled England, commanding armies, defying popes, humiliating kings. Yet when the final curtain fell, her body remained a mystery, her legacy tangled in the cruel irony of her image. She was the Virgin Queen, celebrated, mocked, worshipped, and ridiculed, but never free. Even in death, her sexuality defined her. The Queen's last days were filled with decline. Her body, once paraded as a symbol of eternal youth, had withered into frailty. The paint and powder that had once masked her aging skin could no longer hide the ravages of time. Her teeth were blackened, her hair thinned, her frame weakened. Yet courtiers still approached her as if she were a goddess, terrified of what it meant to imagine an England without Elizabeth. She sat in melancholy silence, refusing food, resisting sleep, as if she were clinging to her crown with sheer force of will. When death finally came, the cruel fascination with her body only deepened. Physicians and courtiers whispered about her virginity, as though death itself might finally reveal the truth. Did she die pure? Or had the long-rumored liaisons with Robert Dudley, the Earl of Essex, or the Duke of Alençon left secret marks that only death could expose? But no confession came. No secret was revealed. Her body, so long dissected by rumor, carried its mystery into the grave. To her enemies, Elizabeth's death was the final vindication. Catholic writers across Europe sneered that the so-called Virgin Queen had left no heir, no dynasty, no continuation of her blood. She had guarded her body so fiercely, they mocked, that she had starved her kingdom of a future. To them she was not a saintly ruler, but a failed woman, barren, unloved, untouched to the point of cruelty. But to her admirers, Elizabeth's virginity became legend. In death she was mythologized not as a woman, but as a symbol, the untouchable queen who gave herself only to England. Poets cast her as a warrior virgin, a second Diana, a woman above the corruption of flesh. Her body, denied to men, was claimed by the state. She had no children of her own, yet England itself was declared her child. Her people were told they were born of her sacrifice. Still, the cruelty remained. For all her mastery of power, Elizabeth never escaped the prison of sexuality. In life she was ridiculed for refusing marriage, mocked as a frigid spinster, or accused of secret lust. In death she was celebrated for purity she may never have wanted, locked forever into a myth that erased her humanity. She was remembered not for her mind, her victories, or her survival, but for her body, a body that had never been allowed to be her own. Her funeral was a grand spectacle. London mourned as if a saint had passed, yet behind the tears was a cold truth: her throne passed not to a child of her body, but to James VI of Scotland, son of her executed cousin Mary Stuart, the very woman Elizabeth had destroyed. The irony was cruel. Elizabeth had lived as the Virgin Queen to secure her reign, yet the dynasty she killed was the dynasty that replaced her. Her untouched body became not only her legend but also her failure. Even her tomb spoke the same contradictions. Buried in Westminster Abbey, Elizabeth was laid alongside her sister Mary Tudor, the half-sibling who had burned Protestants and married Spain's king. The inscription on their tomb reads, "Partners both in throne and grave, here rest we two sisters, Elizabeth and Mary, in hope of one resurrection." But Elizabeth's reputation did not rest. For centuries, gossip, speculation, and slander continued to circle her corpse like vultures. Was she truly a virgin? Did she secretly bear children in the shadows of the court? Was her refusal of marriage a political calculation or a deeply personal wound? These questions, never answered in life, became her legacy in death. Historians, ambassadors, satirists, and kings each claimed her body in their own way, twisting it to serve their purposes. Elizabeth Tudor had been England's queen, but her flesh, her image, her story, these belonged to everyone but herself. And so she passed into myth. To the world she was forever the Virgin Queen, a figure both revered and despised, her sexuality weaponized against her even from the grave. She had wielded virginity as a shield, but it became her prison, sealing her identity in a narrative she could never escape. The cruelty was that Elizabeth, one of the most powerful women in history, could not decide how she would be remembered. Her reign ended, but the fascination with her body never died.